Hello to everyone that is joining this evening's presentation. We're just going to wait a minute or two to allow everyone to join the broadcast, and then we'll get started. So thanks for joining us tonight. I'm seeing lots of people joining the program. Hi there. We're just going to give another minute to let everyone log in who is going to log in tonight. Hey, hello, everyone. I'm seeing some folks saying hi in the chat. Welcome. Definitely seeing some folks from outside of Wisconsin. Welcome. We're just giving everyone another minute to join the presentation. All right. Well, hello everyone again. My name is Kelly Bolter. I am the Adult Programming Coordinator at Milwaukee Public Library here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us tonight. I am very excited for this presentation. We welcome back horticulturalist, author, and speaker Melinda Myers, who will discuss key invasive plants in Wisconsin, share tips on identification, provide ways to control some of the more common problem plants, and suggest alternative plants for your landscape. And also joining us this evening are Jeannie Scherer, who is the Aquatic Invasive Species Outreach Specialist, and Liz Tanner, who is the Organisms and Trade Coordinator with Wisconsin DNR. As I said, I'm from Milwaukee Public Library. We've got quite an exciting lineup of green and sustainability programming this spring. We've got some more programs with Melinda coming up as well. So check our calendar at mpl.org. And we also have another program with Melinda tomorrow evening as well, another webinar. So if you enjoyed tonight's program, please do sign up for tomorrow's program as well. Just some housekeeping. So most of you should have received an email with Melinda's handout in that, so you can look at that attachment and follow along. We'll also be sharing a link to that in the chat in just a few minutes here. So that will also be emailed out again following the program this evening, along with a link to a recording of the program that's going to be posted on Milwaukee Public Library's YouTube channel. So you'll probably see in the bottom of your screen, your mics are disabled, but please feel free to use that chat box and talk amongst yourselves. We will have time at the end for a Q&A with Melinda and Jeannie and Liz. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Jeannie and Liz will be monitoring that throughout the evening, and we'll be sure to get to everyone's questions as best we can. So without further ado, I am very excited to welcome back Melinda Myers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. And I want to thank Jean and Liz as well for joining us. I've tried to reduce this program several times. I feel like I have a lot to share. One about the plants we need to manage and those that we can use in place of them that would be great additions to our landscape. Your handout's very detailed. And so if I've left out some details or you're looking for some more information, there are links as well. So I'm going to get started right away and helping you create a beautiful landscape free of invasive plants. I always like to thank our sponsors, UW-Madison Extension, Natural Resources Institute Aquatic Invasive Species Program, that's where Jeannie's from, and Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Liz, employer, for sponsoring this webinar. That allows me to provide this free of charge. Now, I know we have some people from the Dakotas, Texas, I saw, and some other states. So we're focusing on Wisconsin, but a lot of this applies to you as well. I always like to thank the Public Library, Milwaukee Public Library, Kelly for hosting the event. that allows us to provide this to you. They're such great partners, the local libraries. And I want to thank all of you because you're obviously here today because you want to make a difference. Some of this may be a repeat of information you know, hopefully some new things to consider. And if you know it all, maybe some tips and ideas of resources you can share with others to inspire them to do the same. So I always like to start with what's an invasive plant. Now, if you join me in January, if you're a Master Gardener, Garden Club member, Master Naturalist, you may have joined me Jeannie and Liz and I, the end of January. So a couple of these things are repeat, but we do have a lot of new folks joining us. So what is an invasive plant? It's non-native. This is the Wisconsin description of an invasive plant. Non-native plant that really can cause harm. It grows, it spreads, and it leaves the confines of the landscape. That makes it invasive. The state has decided it's something we need to regulate because it does leave the boundaries of your landscape, but it's invading natural areas. It's becoming established without anything we as people do, and it's causing harm to the environment. And we'll talk about some of those things. What isn't an invasive plant? And this is kind of one of my pet peeves, aggressive plants. These are plants like the gooseneck loosestrife you see here that takes over a garden bed, crowds out all its timid neighbors. It's the bullies in the gardens, right? But they stay within your landscape. They don't go into the nearby woodlands, waterways. And so they're a problem for you as a gardener, but not so much for the environment. Noxious weeds are things that cause harm to livestock, crops, the economy, things that each state has identified. These are problem plants and they manage accordingly. So that's the differences we want to keep in mind. You're here because you probably already know this, but invasive plants outcompete and displace our native plants. And those are the native plants that birds, wildlife, beneficial insects depend upon. They also degrade that habitat. Some ruin soil structure, some ruin the hydrology of the waterways and the ponds and lakes that they're in. We lose that diversity that our natural habitat has. And that's the diversity that diverse wildlife depends upon. And they can also be a vector for disease. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. They also can cause an economic impact. The cost of removing invasive plants is substantial. It can impact recreation. Some of those water invasive plants prevent access for recreational purposes, can damage agriculture and other things, regenerations of forests for production of wood. So it can be costly, and it's something for us to keep in mind. And they also can negatively impact human health. You may may recognize that wild parsnip on the left of your screen. That can cause severe rashes in many people. On the right is buckthorn, or not buckthorn, sorry, barberry, Japanese barberry. We'll talk about Japanese barberry and honeysuckle. Not honeysuckle, but buckthorn later, but they found that Japanese barberry stands create the perfect environment for ticks, and those ticks tend to have a higher percent of Lyme's disease. So something to keep in mind. Here in Wisconsin, we have the DNR NR40, and that invasive species rule identifies what's invasive, what's prohibited, we'll talk about in a minute, and what's restricted, and the list of plants. And so that's what's being managed and regulated. So what is a prohibited plant? Here in Wisconsin, it's something that's rare or not even present in the state, but it has the potential to cause problems. And so these are plants that we could probably eradicate if we get a small infestation, as long as we monitor and aware, or even prevent them from moving in. There is a ban on transporting, so you're not allowed to buy them and bring them into the state, not allowed to own them. So if you have them on your property, we're asking you to get rid of them. We'll talk about disposal in a second, so that they don't spread into our natural areas. Don't transfer, don't share. You know, that's a gift your friends do not need, is an invasive plant. So we're not allowed to introduce them into our landscape. Restricted plants, and hopefully you don't recognize this Bishop's Goutweed, but it's a popular ground cover that's been around for decades, but it has invaded our natural areas. And so these plants are already here and they're already established in the state. So we're not going to be able to get rid of them 100%, but we can reduce the impact by trying to manage those, not allowing more to come in. So there is a ban on transporting them, sharing them, don't share them, introducing them, and not able to buy them here in the state where they're restricted, but you're allowed to keep them. So how are we going to manage those invasive plants? Well, it starts with the right plant for the location and selecting plants that aren't invasive. Shopping locally whenever you can. Our local retailers are regulated. They're visited by nursery inspectors who look for insect disease problems, but also invasive plants. And so they're well aware of the laws and the regulations, and they are not able to sell those invasive plants. Make sure you get the right plant for the growing conditions. As gardeners, we always say this, right? You want to make sure the plant is not invasive in your state. So invasives.org is a national website that I always try to check because I'm lucky enough to work with all of you gardeners beyond Wisconsin, as well as inside our state. So invasives.org is a good place to see if something you're interested in adding to the landscape is safe or invasive in your area. Avoid aggressive plants that you can't manage. We all think we're going to have time, right? Myself included. And so avoiding those or limiting those aggressive plants, it'll make your job a lot easier. And of course, don't buy invasive plants. Avoiding the problem, as I mentioned, right plant, right place, no invasive plants. And if you purchase plants online, always check to see if one, if it's a reputable site, and two, that plant you're ordering is not invasive, because there are online sources that may be selling them even though they're not allowed, that may not be aware of the restrictions in your state. And so it's really up to you to avoid buying those. And not crossing the state lines where maybe you can buy a plant that's banned in your state and bring it in for your water feature. We're all trying to work together to make a difference and manage these. And of course, growing healthy plants. That means less work for you. Those healthy plants are better able to outcompete those invasive plants. And if you can plant natives whenever possible, good option, because they have evolved with the birds and beneficial insects and wildlife. And so one, they tend to be assertive if the conditions are right. And two, they're going to support the wildlife and be better able to compete the invasives. But if you're looking at a big patch of, this is Dame's rocket, we'll talk about it more. Maybe initially what you want to do is just cut off the flowers before they set seed. That's going to eliminate thousands of seedlings you're going to have to manage in the future. This is the first step, and at least you're managing the spread by doing this. So that's one thing you could do. Physically removing the whole plant, roots, stems, flowers, seeds, all of that. If you can remove it, that works pretty well with small populations. And that's kind of the focus I'm going to take tonight in terms of removal. Biocontrols, and Jeannie manages the purple loosestrife biocontrol here in Wisconsin. So if you want to know more about it or you have some questions, one, she's happy to answer in the chat, but we can also talk about it a bit more in the Q&A. I know a lot of research is happening trying to look for biological organisms, diseases, insects, or things like that that can help us manage invasive species, because that's a little bit less labor intensive and might really give us that edge we need to manage them. Chemicals, before you reach for a chemical, definitely check with the Wisconsin DNR if you're a resident here, or your local Department of Natural Resources or University Extension office, because they're going to tell you the best products to use and the timing. Those two things are very important in terms of success, because if you apply it at the wrong time or use the wrong product, you're putting down chemicals needlessly and won't get the results you want. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources also requires a permit, and that the application of that chemical be done by a certified applicator if you're working in a wetland, waterway, or any shorelines near a waterway. And those are important to keep in mind. So check again with your local Department of Natural Resources before you start spraying those areas. As always, read and follow label directions carefully. And the last thing I want to mention about management, I was just at a webinar, a presentation on invasive species, And they talked about it's not a once and done, and that's true. These things didn't take over the landscape in 1 year, just feels that way. And so this is something we're going to start managing and then continue to monitor for resprouting and problems. There also may be an occasion to do some solarization. We talked a little bit about this in the January webinar. This is a garden in my bed I used to manage weeds, not invasive species, but it was the picture I had, and I'm kind of doing it a little bit wrong. So if you're going to use solarization, you're going to edge your garden bed, cover it with clear plastic, anchor it better than with the post I used with soil. So I need to improve my method. Now, for those of us in colder climates, Kansas found it's about a 6-week period. You need to leave it covered with clear plastic to kill weed seeds, perennial weed rhizomes, and other items like that because we're in a colder climate. I've got a couple of connections, a couple links in the handout to more information on this. Occultation, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, is smothering. So that's using black plastic or carpet or something like that to block the sunlight. It doesn't penetrate as deep, but it may be an option for getting a jump start on the season. But if you fought goutweed, for example, for years, it might be worth doing solarization and sacrificing this growing season to try to manage that problem. And then dispose of things properly. Always check with your local municipality because there are restrictions on what we can throw in the trash. Most allow you to bag up and throw invasive species into your garbage. Some require you to bag them like you see here and label them before you put them in the trash. The idea is they're going to be buried in the landfill, and so that gets them out of the environment. Composting is really probably not an option for most of us, and here's why. Most of us do not get our compost piles hot enough to kill the weed seeds, rhizomes, and even some of those plants. And the last thing you want to do is create compost filled with problems that you put back in the garden. So all your efforts pulling, removing really are wasted. So you're better off to pitch those invasive plants and use other items for your compost pile. When I was doing some research on buckthorn, because I have some in my yard along with some honeysuckle, I found this on the DNR website, and it's kind of counterintuitive, at least for me. I thought, well, I should start where it's bad and work my way out. But the reason they recommend starting in the outliers, those few plants that are outside of that core area, is you can get a jump start and stop the progression into the surrounding area. So we're going to remove those few outliers, continue to monitor, and as we take care of that, we'll move to the advancing front. Notice there's a lot more plants, and the core is the lowest priority only because it's so infested. And so most of the time, if you have a big infestation, you can't manage it all by yourself, all in one season. And so you might want to give that a try. This resource, there's a link to it in your handout. And I find this really helpful because it talks about when to look for the invasive species. Most of them on this handout are listed, and this is based on Wisconsin. So those of you in other states may need to adjust the bloom time and emergence. But I think if you're not familiar with all of them or you're feeling overwhelmed, this is a great way. Okay, it's April. What do I need to look for? It's March. What's up and growing? This year, I bet we're going to see some things a little earlier in parts of the country. So let's start with a few of the aquatic invasive plants to avoid. Water lettuce. This is a very popular water garden plant used as a floater, used as a surface plant. Easy to identify, right? Because look at those velvety leaves, those parallel veins. Now in Wisconsin, it does not have a long enough season to bloom, but it will in other areas. So removing those small infestations, that's an option to do. And I forgot to mention, this one is prohibited. So we find it here and there in water gardens. And I have to say, Jeannie set me up to look at a homeowner had bought some of these plants not knowing it was a problem, and she got rid of them right away once she found out. And so often we think we're buying a good plant, somebody sells it, so no need to be embarrassed. Now you know what to do to get rid of it. So these are pretty plants, but easy to manage the small populations. And that's what we're hoping will happen, is that if you see them, you will take care of them. Never, ever release them into natural waterways. Water hyacinths is a beautiful plant, and that's often how these plants get their start, right? They're low maintenance, hardy, spread quickly, pretty plants. We put them in the garden and they're just a little too aggressive. And this is one that is prohibited, so we shouldn't be buying it. So if anyone tries to sell it to you, don't buy it. And it's one that we need to make sure that we monitor and report if you see it to your local. There's some contacts in your handout to the Department of Natural Resources. Those lavender flowers that appear throughout the summer are very easy to identify. Kind of a nice lavender with that yellow dot and a little bit deeper purple towards the base. Then look at the bottom of those leaves, those stems, that swollen bulb, that base helps it float and it makes it easy to identify. Yellow floating heart. I think this slide kind of says it all. Can you imagine trying to get your boat in to this area? Can you imagine if you're a crane or an egret trying to do some fishing? You can't even penetrate and get to the water. It also is blocking that exchange of oxygen, and so it degrades water quality. It really degrades the habitat that the fish need to survive. And so this is one we really want to avoid getting into our state. So again, it's prohibited. Pretty easy to identify those leaves that are kind of kidney shaped, arrowhead. The flowers have 5 petals, but look at how fringed they are on the edge. So they're very distinct. It blooms May to frost in areas where it does occur, and those leaves are out early. And so if you suspect this might be a problem in a nearby waterway or lake, or that you have it in your pond, watch for it and then put that on the list to get rid of. European frog bit. It's another one that's prohibited. Look at those leaves, are very distinct, glossy and thick. They look a lot like water lily leaves. Those flowers have 3 petals, bright white with yellow centers, making it easy to identify. And so this is another one that we want to make sure we keep out of the waterways. Yellow flag iris is a popular garden plant. And some of you may have this growing in your garden as well as your water feature. As you can see, this was planted right along, I don't know if this was a pond or a shoreline of a waterway or river, but it's a beauty and it looks a lot like other iris, right? But here's a couple things to watch for. Before it flowers, it can be hard to identify. And if you look closely above that bottom yellow flower a little bit to the right, you might be able to see that ridge that goes down the middle of the leaf. That's one way to differentiate it between other irises. Once the flowers are up, it's pretty easy to see that it is yellow. And easy to identify that way. Flowers May or June, kind of depending on the season, they can be almost white to this really dark yellow. The seeds on the left, you can see, are pretty distinct. Now, this one spreads by dropping seeds in the water, so it can float down the river or across the pond or across the lake. Also, chunks of the rhizome can break apart and then travel and get reestablished in other areas. And so that's how this plant spreads. So removing the plant, roots, rhizomes, and all, and again, monitor because it's easy to miss a little bit that then can start a new plant. Japanese knotweed. This is one I became familiar with about 40 years ago. I had a call from someone when I worked at Extension that said, I got bamboo growing in my backyard. And I'm like, I don't think so. And it's growing a foot a day and it's just taken over. Well, I went out and this is the plant. It was Japanese knotweed. And if you look at those stems, they're hollow if you cut them open, but do you see those little ridges? It looks like bamboo. So they weren't off base when they were describing it, but it is not bamboo, but it is restricted. It is here. I have seen city lots that have nothing but this plant growing, and it spreads by rhizomes. It spreads by seeds. The birds disperse those seeds. And so a couple things, there's a couple of good publications on managing this plant, and there are links in your handout. So the Department of Natural Resources recommends when the plant's 4 to 5 feet tall, cut it back. And then when it grows up to 3 feet tall, use a total vegetation killer like a Roundup that contains glyphosate. it's going to take several application. I've talked to many gardeners who have used that and found that it's very difficult. So you want to try to dig and remove if possible, and then you may have to resort to using a chemical. Remember, in your backyard, that's one thing. Along waterways, you'll need a permit here in Wisconsin. This is in Scotland, but I have seen some pretty nasty invasions of this Japanese knotweed. Not only does it take over and crowd out native plants, it disrupts the soil and causes erosion and can be a problem that way. So hopefully you don't have that one. Lesser celandine. This is one that has a native look-alike marsh marigold we'll talk about later. Often found growing on moist areas along waterways, can grow in the water. It spreads rapidly, as you can see here. It bullies out the native plants. It disrupts the soil, can cause erosion because it does die back sooner than, say, our marsh marigold. And so the soil's not held intact. But a couple ways to identify the kidney-shaped leaves that you can see here. They emerge early. Lots of yellow flowers early in the season, same times marsh marigolds do. And at the base, there are little whitish bulblets that form right at the stem axils. And so that's another way to identify it. So in this one, we've got lesser celandine on the left and marsh marigold on the right. Notice lesser celandine has more petals and they're narrower, and that's one way to differentiate the two. And so kind of keeping an eye out and watching for those two to help identify. Butterfly dock, Petasites, and there's a whole group of Petasites, and they're working on trying to fine-tune identification. Some are invasive, some are aggressive, some we're keeping an eye on. Petasites hybridus, butterfly dock. Look at those huge leaves. Probably reminds you of rhubarb, right? And this plant flowers as the leaves emerge. As the leaves emerge, and so the flowers are close to the ground. And then as the leaves emerge, the flower stem extends. And so as you saw earlier, above and kind of amongst the leaves. So digging and dividing, removing all of the root system and disposing of properly. You may decide to resort to chemicals, again, if you are away from the waterway. But if you are near it, make sure you don't need a permit. Japanese butterbur is not restricted, but we are a little concerned. And I have seen this plant growing where it pushes up through blacktop. If you're considering this plant, I would definitely avoid planting it along waterways because the last thing you want it to do is to end up spreading and taking over the shoreline. And then it's going to be a lot harder to manage. And before you plant anything, this is one I definitely think twice about. It's a cool plant, but it's going to cause you a lot of headaches. And we're keeping an eye on it because it could become a problem down the road. So we got other plants that would be better. Yes, you can plant hardy non-native water lilies in your garden. We just hope that you will keep them in your garden. It is illegal to put them into natural waterways, lakes, and ponds. But why we're concerned is we're finding there's some concern that these are hybridizing with our native water lilies. And when we have a native that ends up hybridized by a cultivated variety, often the vigor's increased and that non-native can take over and crowd out the native plants. So keep them in your waterway, keep them in your natural water features, your ponds, your water gardens. Do not place them into waterways because that's how they can spread. And fish, a lot of you may have fish in your ponds and in your personal ponds and your water features, but don't release them into public waterways. I know a lot of times at the end of the season, people are like, I can't kill the fish and I don't have anything to do with them if you can't overwinter them. There are some places that will kind of fish sit for the winter. They've set up tanks to do that. Some places may even buy them back. You want to check out your options. There's probably a water gardener that may be willing to help you out that has the space to overwinter them if you don't. But do not release them into the public waterway. Illegal, but it can lead to big problems. So here are a few options for floating plants. And the reason we want floating plants is they shade the water, so keeping it cool, especially during really hot summers. And they also absorb dissolved nutrients. So as the fish are pooping, the plants are using it. And so that's a way that the plants get the nutrients they need and keep those nutrients from polluting the water. And these are plants that aren't going to cover to such a level that the native plants can't survive and that the fish and the other aquatic wildlife are able to enjoy. So if this is our native white water lily, you can see a dragonfly on the leaf. Pretty beautiful white, bright flowers, hardy in zones 4 to 11. I included hardiness zones because I know there are folks that may be from north of here, the North Dakotas and south of here. Fragrant flowers in the summer. It needs those areas where the water isn't rapidly moving. So maybe those little alcoves or in your water features where you don't have that waterfall maybe to the side as opposed to under where the water is being moved. This is a great pollinator plant. As you can see, bees and butterflies and flies, turtles and ducks will munch on it as well. Yellow pond lily. This is native into parts of North America. Nice, big, glossy, bold leaves, yellow flowers that you can see here. It does best in full to part sun, or shade, I'm sorry, full sun, full to part shade. So it's a good shade tolerant plant. Zones 4 to 10, it's hardy and it blooms throughout the summer. Just like our native white water lily, it prefers still water. Sometimes this one is one that ducks and muskrats will feed on, and the deer unfortunately do like it. But if it's into the water, hopefully less of an issue. And waterfowl will eat the seeds. So you're helping to support nature and having a pretty plant. So these are plants that you could grow in the shallow. Some you may be growing in terrestrial on land as well. Pickrel weed, beautiful plant. It does spread sometimes a little aggressively, as you can see here, pretty purple flowers, nice kind of arrowhead shaped leaves. Likes full sun, hardy zones 5 to 10. Again, it's another summer bloomer, so you're going to have this nice foliage as well as some nice plants. It likes to be kind of in the shallows, 12-inch water, and not any deeper than that. And then keep it in mind, it will spread, so you may need to do a little managing. And it's a great pollinator plant. And again, mammals feeding on some of the seeds. Blue flag iris. A lot of us have grown this in our gardens, in containers, in water gardens. It's a great shoreline plant and it's native to much of North America. Full sun, part shade, hardy, zones 3 to 9. You can see that bee kind of tucked in there, pollinating on trying to gather nectar and pollen. It's great for a substitute for yellow iris because this one is not invasive, it is native. But you could also grow it in a pot in a water garden or in your garden beds as well. Bees, as you can see here, butterflies and pollinators, as well as hummingbirds. Hummingbirds really love the iris, so this is a nice addition to the landscape. Maybe you want a couple of non-natives. Cannas, a lot of us are growing cannas in our garden, but what you may not have known is you can also grow them in the water. I have a link to a website that talks about how to transition your canna into a water feature. Now, those of us in the north, this is only hardy from zones 8 to 11, so we need to either overwinter the rhizomes or the plant in its pot. I have some in a trug in the basement with water in them for the winter. These do get pretty big. Best to let them go dormant, but sometimes they start growing. So I had to grow mine under lights last winter, but add a lot of beauty and height. Elephant ears, again, you may be growing them in pots. You may be growing them in your garden. You may be growing them in the shallows of your water feature or in a pot set in your water feature. Those big, bold leaves make great additions, give you that tropical feel to the landscape. Hardy in zones 8 to 12, there's 2 different genus of elephant ears. So depending on which one you're growing, check the tag or the catalog description. Blooms For most of us in the north, not at all. Occasionally, I'll see somebody in the south post a picture of the flowers. Not that ornamental. It's more of those mine flowered for me, and it's exciting. And this is when you could overwinter either as a house plant in a sunny window or under lights, or just like your cannas do as a dormant tuber or bulb. Papyrus, cypress, great as a focal point in containers, potted with your annuals and perennials in the soil, or it can be grown as a water plant. This was at our botanic garden here, and one of the things I loved about it is they had these potted up in a water garden potting mix, set it inside containers that did not have drainage holes, and kept them in water. That way, when you go on vacation, guess what? You don't have to worry about getting a plant sitter. So I thought that was a great way to take advantage of the canna and papyrus. You could do this with your elephant ears. Even if you don't have a water garden, you might want to have a pot featuring these plants that reduces the maintenance. So papyrus, it likes full sun to part shade. You've probably grown them, zones 9 to 12. So again, this is one either you move inside as a house plant if you're not in those hardiness zones, or let it die, or pass it on to somebody else. There's usually some gardener that'll take on your plants. And then these are for the moist edges and your garden bed. I mentioned marsh marigold before, and there's a beautiful planting when I used to teach in Mequon, which is north of Milwaukee. I'd go by this little stream in this woodland area, and it was always blooming marsh marigolds. Bright flowers that just brighten up that spring when everything's dormant, just starting to emerge, and the leaves persist, so they help hold the soil in place. So full sun to part shade, I've seen it in fairly heavy shade, but that's blooming in the spring before the leaves come out and tolerating that shade after they're done flowering. So they got a good bit of sunlight early in the season. You can see hardy in zones 3 to 8 and is deer resistant. So that's a big plus. So many of us are fighting deer and rabbits these days. And then it's a good pollinator plant as well. And I know I'm going through these quickly. A lot of this detail is in your handout, as well as you can watch the recording and fast forward through the parts you know. Golden Alexander, this is a popular rain garden plant. I first saw it in the woodland garden at our nearby nature center. It takes full sun to part shade, and I've seen it grown in fairly heavy shade and still flower. You can see those flowers are in the umbel family, may remind you of like a carrot or something like that. A couple feet tall, great for woodland areas, great for rain gardens, will take moist conditions, some temporary flooding, but will also grow quite well in the ground. And a great pollinator plant and host plant. So there are insects that use that to raise their young. Cardinal flower, I think we all love it, but not all of us have had success, and I count myself in that group. It's a short-lived perennial, meaning it may only last a few years in your garden. If you have planted it and failed, you are in the majority of gardeners I talk to, and I'm in there with you. But those beautiful red flowers are hummingbird magnets, and they do support other pollinators. As you can see here, it grows in water. So you could grow it in a pond, you could grow it in your waterway, but it also grows in the soil, in the garden. It's finding that perfect spot that I find the challenge. Full sun to part shade. Even though it sits in water, good drainage is helpful to keep it coming back. A friend of mine has this beautiful prairie and one cardinal flower, and she said she never grows, it never spreads, but that plant keeps coming back. So even the best horticulturists sometimes struggle with that. It's great not only for those hummingbirds, but also other pollinators. A nice vertical accent in the garden. Blue vervain, and there's a hoary vervain. This blue vervain tolerates moist soil, while the hoary vervain, and I had to write this down even though I have it because it's Verbena stricta is the hoary vervain. That's for the drier areas. That's what I'm growing in my sandy prairie type garden, and this one is better for those moist areas. Look at that tall plant, a very unique flower. Full sun locations, you can see here it's growing right next to the water. And can you see that bumblebee nectaring on the flowers? It's a mid to late summer bloomer. So it's kind of nice. It takes over after some of those spring blooming perennials are finished. As I mentioned, this is the vervain that needs that moist soil. Deer resistant, the rabbits may do some damage. And I just want to mention deer resistant doesn't mean immune. If the populations are high enough and they're hungry enough, they'll eat anything, as you've probably found. But these are plants, if deer are a problem, you might want to include some of these to increase your odds of success. I love turtle head. It's shade tolerant. It's a fall bloomer. This is our native turtle head. There are a lot of cultivated varieties. Very shade tolerant. I've seen it in fairly heavy shade and still flower. Popular for rain gardens. Popular in gardens where the soil can be kept relatively moist but well drained. This is another one that blooms mid to late summer into fall, and great, as you can see, for pollinators. And even the hummingbirds will nectar on these flowers. Marsh blazing star, one of the liatris. There are several liatris native to North America, and this one will tolerate, as the name suggests, moist soils, right? So best in full sun. It will take it moist, like some decent drainage. A lot of you may be growing this in your garden. So it not only takes it moist, but it's fairly tolerant of drier conditions. It's a late summer bloomer. And so again, it's a great way to end the season. Not only to add some color to those moist areas or your garden beds, but also to help support late season pollinators. And the hummingbirds, believe it or not, will nectar on this plant. Leave the seed heads intact, those fuzzy seed heads, and watch the songbirds eat those seeds throughout the winter. It does reseed. If it's happy, it will reseed readily. So you may have plants to move to other parts of your garden. So watch for those seedlings, and you can keep it in line if needed, or plant it with some other vigorous plants. To me, looks so exotic, but it is native to much of North America. Swamp rose mallow, those big dinner plate size flowers. It's in the hibiscus family, as you can see, likes moist soils. One of the things, I've got several of these growing in my gardens. I need to move them. I put them in the wrong place. Something got taller in front of them. Hardy to zone 4. So as tropical as this looks, it's a pretty hardy plant. These are late to emerge in the spring. You know, you're looking at this dead plant. I leave mine stand for winter, and then I just cut them back after I'm sure all the pollinators have left, and I do my cleanup. You know, once the temperatures are hovering in the 50s, I'll do my garden cleanup, but I leave these stems about 6 inches high so that I'm sure not to accidentally dig them up thinking they're dead. Some people plant bulbs, not if it's in a wet area, but if you're in a garden situation, put something else nearby that's going to emerge earlier to avoid accidentally digging them up. Great for hummingbirds, just like the other hibiscus, as well as pollinators. If you want something big and bold and beautiful, Joe Pye weed is a late season bloomer, and it is sure to impress you. Even the dwarf cultivars like Gateway are 5 feet tall. Little Joe is about 3 feet tall, but I don't think is impressive. So Joe Pye weed really needs moist soil conditions to do well. It's not drought tolerant. Full sun, light shade. Again, it's a great late season bloomer. June, if you're a little bit further south, but more mid to late season, the further north you go. Great for pollinator plants. Deer and rabbits tend to leave it be. And so that's a good plus for this plant as well. And so it's a good mid to late season flowering plant. Sedges, and we'll talk about more sedges in the next batch of plants I'm going to cover, but fox sedge can be relatively assertive in the garden. I like it because it reminds me of the native prairie drop seed, but you can see sedges are not grasses. They look like grasses. The old saying is sedges have edges, triangular stems. And so that's one way to tell them apart. And then when they bloom, you can see those flowers are very distinct. This is 1 to 3 feet tall. So this is a good one to include with other plants that tend to be aggressive, so they can kind of find ways to live happily together and fill that space. Birds will feed on the seeds, and the deer tend to leave this be. I did 2 other webinars for the Department of Natural Resources that still live on my website, and they featured water gardens and invasive plants, and then growing rainwater, and shoreline plants. And so those are still available to watch, and the handouts are as well. And there's a link in your handout for both. So here are a few of the bad guys we see growing on the land. Woodland forget-me-nots. There are some native forget-me-nots. It's restricted because it's out here and we have a lot of it. And I was very sad to see it was restricted, but it takes over the woods and it routes out other plants. And it was one of those I didn't realize until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the damage that this forget-me-not does. It has simple alternate leaves. Okay, that means they march kind of like stairs going up each side of the stem. The flowers are that distinct sky blue with the yellow center. Brunera, which I didn't mention, Siberian bug loss, has similar flowers and is not invasive. So if you like the look of these flowers, it's a spring bloomer, great foliage, Brunera. And then this one's blooms most of the season. So it's producing lots of seeds. It spreads by rhizomes and it crowds out the plants as it expands. So one way to tell this apart from the good forget-me-nots is when you look at the sepals, and those are the little protective coverings at the base of the plant. They have little hooked hairs. And so when you look at those, and you can kind of see some of the sepals persisting below the flowers, get a hand lens out. And if they're hooked, then you know this is the bad ones and you need to get rid of them. Moneywort, boy, a popular ground cover. I have to admit, I grew this in my house in Milwaukee before I knew how aggressive it was and that it was an invasive problem. It spreads into riparian forest. Pieces break off and spread. So when it's on a waterway edge or a shoreline or in a natural waterway, pieces can break and spread. So this one is restricted, so it's out in the garden, but we'd like to stop its spread. Yellow flowers early throughout much of the season. Look at those leaves. You can tell why it's called money plant. They're round and they look just like coins. They spread, the stems grow and spread from the main plant and can root along the stems. I had this root into a 6-inch pot, a nursery pot that I had left standing out for winter, just hadn't found it sitting in the garden bed, and it survived. So it tells you how tough this plant is. So this is one you don't want to deal with it in your garden. So start getting rid of it, but definitely do not allow it to spread into natural areas. Bright yellow flowers with 5 petals and can flower most of the season. Here in Wisconsin, the cultivars are not restricted. So when it says exempt in Wisconsin, it means it is not restricted or prohibited, but this is very aggressive. So before you put it in the garden, make sure you want it and you can contain it. So maybe cement like you see here is the best option. I mentioned Bishop's Goutweed earlier, popular ground cover that was, I get calls from people all the time. How do I get rid of it? It came with the house. We saw it a lot in old landscapes and it's persisted. And when you take a look at those flowers that are on stems above the foliage, they kind of remind me of Queen Anne's lace, kind of lacy, not good. Not good because it can spread by seed, but also by underground rhizomes. If you've been fighting this plant, you know. Green or variegated leaves, and you can see the green ones here. And those leaves are in groups of 3. So each leaf is 3 leaflets, okay? And then there are 3 of those groups of 3 leaflet leaves together on a stem. Now, a lot of people will bring samples of this to me and say they thought they had poison ivy because it does kind of resemble that. Usually they tell me that after I stick my hand in the bag and I start to pull it out and go, I think I've got poison ivy. So if you're ever taking a plant to be identified and you think it might be poison ivy, warn the person before they stick their hand in it. But this is one that is very difficult. Edging the garden bed, trying solarization, you'll have to remove the good plants from that garden bed. I would suggest potting them up to make sure you didn't take any pieces of this plant. Or you may decide sacrifice everything in the garden, sacrifice a year, and do some solarization. You will need several applications of a total vegetation killer if in fact you try to treat it with a chemical. Dame's rocket, most people tell me they think they have woodland phlox because it blooms early in the season. It's on the woodland edge. It's also included in many native wildflower planting mixes. It is not native. but was included in some. Now, if you take a close look, you can see it has 4 petals. The flowers may be white, purple, or pink. It produces hundreds of seeds, long, narrow seed pods that release lots of seeds. The flowers are fragrant. That's another clue. Seeds heavily. So it blooms in late spring or early summer. So a couple things you can do. Cut it back before it sets seeds to prevent it from spreading. Even more, of course, digging and removal is very important as well. And often recommended to treat that one with a vegetation killer. When you look at, and I want to just double check the timing on that. In the fall, I wanted to make sure I was remembering right. So when the rosette of leaves are coming up, most of the spring ephemerals have died back to the ground. You could do an application of a total vegetation killer then. But you want to be careful that you don't get a lot of spillage onto the soil and onto anything else that might be growing. So I'm always hesitant to do total vegetation killers in native areas where I'm worried about making sure I maintain those good guys. Hopefully this isn't what your yard looks like. Japanese barberry is restricted here in Wisconsin. It is a very aggressive plant, but there's weird restrictions on this plant. There are some cultivars that are exempt that can be sold here. So this is a close look at the barberry. If you look at it, the leaves are kind of spoon-shaped, spatulate or spoon-shaped, in clusters around the bud. The flowers are bright yellow, usually earlier in the season. And then the fruit remind me of red Tic Tacs. And the birds spread, they eat the fruit and spread it, so will other mammals. And so check with your local DNR, Department of Natural Resources, because here in Wisconsin, there are some cultivars that are sterile, that are exempt, and can be sold here in our state. And the same may hold true for you. And then it also lists the species and a couple of cultivars that are restricted and cannot be sold here. Burning bush. Here in Wisconsin, the species and the cultivar Nordine are restricted, and they're the very popular ones. And this is why it's popular, bright red fall color. But I've got some solutions for you, some better options in a minute. And so it has spread rapidly. This is an easy one to ID. It's called winged euonymus at times. And if you look at those stems, see those corky ridges look like little wings. So that makes it easy to ID even when the leaves aren't present. The fruit capsules remind me a little bit of bittersweet. It's one way that they're spread is the birds will take them, eat them, and drop them off. In Wisconsin, you might want to check, but it's the species, Euonymus elatus, and the Nordine cultivar that are restricted. The other cultivars are exempt from that restriction here in Wisconsin. But always check the DNR website, because as we learn more about other plants, we find out, we keep learning more and more about things that we shouldn't be planting. Common buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica, and the name tells you something about it. It's cathartic. So the birds eat it and then it runs right through them. So it's not good for them, and they poop the seeds everywhere. And that's one of the big ways they spread. It's also allelopathic, meaning it gives off a chemical that reduces the competition. So it keeps other plants from growing around it and competing. This one has black fruit, and I want to show you a picture in a minute. It's restricted, can't be sold here. It's in the landscapes and natural areas, unfortunately, so we want to keep working on removal. Glossy buckthorn has red fruit that turns black, and this may be flowering, have immature red fruit and black fruit all at the same time. It is cathartic as well, and this was a popular hedge plant, as was the Rhamnus cathartica. This one's been renamed. You'll find it listed 2 ways as Frangula ulmus or Rhamnus frangula. So a couple things. When you look at it, notice those black buds. This is common buckthorn. Notice how those buds clasp the stem. They remind me of a buck's hooves, buckthorn. The tip is a modified bud that's a spine. So that's one of the things. Notice how the veins kind of curve around the edge. Now this one has fine serrations, while glossy buckthorn does not. Kind of resembles dogwood, but dogwood, unlike the glossy buckthorn, This is alternate. See how those leaves go alternate sides of the stem? Dogwood, all but pagoda dogwood, are opposite. Buckthorn is sub-opposite. Those buds are almost opposite, just a little less, but it has fine serration. So a way to tell the difference, because we like our native dogwoods, we want to leave them. Just a quick note on common teasel. I'll tell you, boy, I see this along the roadway, the freeways near where I live. It's often picked and used for arrangements. Don't do that because it can release seeds into your landscape as well as natural areas. You may be amazed to see that one plant can release up to 2,000 seeds each year. Isn't that scary? No wonder it's taking over. You probably see this as you drive along the roadways. It tolerates hot, dry locations. It spreads readily, and people see these and think, oh, they're pretty, and they include them in their arrangements. And so don't do that, because you're only going to cause yourself problems as well as our natural environment. I was driving up to Green Bay the other day for a conference, and boy, this is all I saw in the ditches along the freeways was Fragmides. Very, very awful plant. In Wisconsin, there are some areas where it's prohibited and some areas where it's restricted. Those areas where it hasn't, really taken off, it's prohibited, but not a plant to add to the landscape. And at least minimally keep monitoring your landscape if you have any of this growing nearby along roadways or ditches to manage it in your own property. That's at least one thing, you may be able to do to manage this problem. Long leaves, as you can see, long, narrow grass-like leaves. The flowers are light brown to purple and they're plumes. And then that seed head is kind of fluffy and pretty obvious. It's a big plant. It grows pretty tall. Growing along ditches, roadways, disturbed sites, waterways, it really can degrade the shoreline. So it's one we want to try to get a handle on. Oriental Bittersweet, sold as an ornamental plant and used as a vine. It's very, very aggressive. It is restricted here in Wisconsin. I want you to note those leaves are kind of rounded with a point at the end. It produces fruit that's often used in decorations. Again, another one, don't use this as a decoration in your pots outside or on your door, because those seeds can end up being planted in your yard or landscape or in natural areas nearby. It's a twining vine. You need one male for every 1 to 5 female to get fruit. So if you've got fruit, you've got a male plant somewhere nearby. Fleshy fruit seeds, once it opens, easy to distinguish. There is our native American bittersweet. It is aggressive. Autumn Revolution is one that is self-stare or is fertile, sorry. So you don't need a male and female, and it will produce fruit, but it is aggressive as well. So take a look at the two. The American bittersweet tends to have a little bit more elliptical shaped leaf, not as rounded with that point at the end. The fruit appear at the end of the stem with American bittersweet, where it appears in the axils of Oriental bittersweet. I put a link to a handout from the University of Minnesota that goes through some of the detail. They talk about the color of the fruit covering, where Oriental tends to be yellow and American more orange. But when you look at these, they're pretty similar. So it can be very hard to discern, I think, with using that color. But check that out, because that's got great detail and good pictures. So I'm going to quickly go through, and I know I promised these guys I'd be done in an hour. So Canadian ginger, very shade tolerant, great under spruce trees, great under those dense canopies of Norway maple. You can see the flowers here early in the season. They appear beneath the leaves. This is deciduous. It dies back, unlike European ginger. Pioneers, colonists use these as a substitute for the real ginger, but it's a great plant and deer resistant and good for those areas in the shade where you can't get anything else to grow. Ornamental and native sedges, some grow well in sun, some grow well in shade. This is Pennsylvania sedge, often used as a ground cover. Some people cut it back once a month for a more lawn type option in those shady areas. Some can be very aggressive, so always check the tag for spreading so that you don't end up creating a nightmare. But again, grass-like plants that are deer resistant. I planted, this is actually from my garden. I saw a friend's Facebook page, golden groundsel, and it's great for dry shade, moist, well-drained soils. I have sandy soil, and I put this in. It bloomed the first year. It's slowly spreading. So the leaves hug the soil, as you can see here, but the flower stems can be quite tall. The first picture was looking down. Moist to wet, well-drained, but mine don't get watered, and they're doing okay. The deer tend to leave them be, and they're also pollinator friendly. If you've heard me speak, this is one of my favorite ground covers, barrenwort. 4 seasons of interest. When the leaves emerge, they have a red tinge and the flowers begin. They turn green for summer, red for the fall. It tolerates dry shade as well as, I've seen this in full sun on one of our boulevard plantings, but it really prefers part to full shade. Can be slow to get started, but once it gets started, it's a nice ground cover, about 8 inches, 12 inches tall. But you've got multiple seasons of interest. And those of you in the South, it actually is evergreen. Coral bells, popular perennial ground cover, a nice mix of them can give you beautiful kind of a tapestry effect. One of the things to keep in mind, the coral bells that have villosa in their parentage, the Heuchera villosa, are more heat and humidity tolerant. So if you've had problems with them melting out, consider that one. There is a native, Heuchera americana, if you want to stick with native plants. Great for hummingbirds and butterflies. The deer tend to leave these be. Woodland phlox, not Dame's Rocket. Notice this has 5 petals. It's this beautiful periwinkle blue in the spring. I've got mine planted near some garden glow dogwood that has really chartreuse foliage in the spring. It makes a nice contrast. Rabbits and voles can be a problem on this plant, so keep an eye out for that, and even deer at times. This is the plant many people call Dame's Rocket. This is the good guy. This is our native plant, 9 to 12 inches tall, moist but well drained, and it really prefers some shade. If you've got sunny areas, consider garden phlox. Much taller, can be 3 or 4 feet tall. Many are fragrant. They also are attractive not only to butterflies, but also hummingbirds. They like full sun, as I mentioned. They are prone to powdery mildew. So look for those mildew-resistant cultivars, but great summer blooms. Will rebloom if you deadhead, and deer and rabbits do like to eat them as well. I find great blue lobelia is a much easier plant to grow than cardinal flower. And so it's still attractive to hummingbirds. It just doesn't have those bright red flowers that the cardinal flower does. It can spread and form colonies, but it's manageable. It's not out of control. Hardy in zones 3 to 9, as you can see here. It's a late season bloomer. So this is another one that supports our late season pollinators, adds that color before fall sets in totally. And the deer tend to leave it be. I wasn't going to include swamp milkweed because we got so many milkweeds covered, but I decided to add this. Swamp milkweed's a great rain garden plant because it takes it wet and it will tolerate temporary dry periods, just what rain gardens do. It also tends not to be as aggressive as common milkweed. Common milkweed is great for the monarchs, so is this one, but it spreads by underground rhizomes and seed and can be hard to manage. Swamp milkweed tends to stay contained, still a host for monarch butterfly caterpillars and other pollinators as well. Prairie dropseed is probably one of my favorite ornamental and native grasses. A nice clump of arching branches, fine texture. Reminds me of the ornamental fountain grass, but this one's native. What's nice about this is it does flower later in the season. They smell like, I think, burnt popcorn, but coriander sounds better. Fall color, orange, beigey orange fall color. And when the seeds are covered with ice, they look like little gems. And so it's great for birds and it's good for pollinators as well. And it's one that easily blends into any informal, formal, even formal or natural gardens. Little blue stem can be a problem with heavy clay soils. It will survive, but it tends to be floppy until it gets those deep roots established. Nice blue-green foliage like you see here. Good fall color. fluffy seed pods, and it does stand for winter. So 4 seasons of interest. 2 to 3 feet tall, moist, well drained to dry soils once established. It does need full sun, and good drainage will give you better results. Our native switchgrass. This is what I think we should be planting by our freeways. If the species reseeds readily, so it's probably one, unless you have a huge area you want to fill with switchgrass, you may want to use one of the native cultivars, the native vars, a cultivar of this native grass. It prefers full sun. It can take a little light shade. It will tolerate clay soil. Lots of cultivars available from 3 feet to 6 feet tall. Again, those cultivars tend to be clumpers and not spread readily. Finches like the seeds. It is a host plant for some skipper caterpillars. And again, a late season bloomer with great winter interest. I almost deleted this because it can be a little hard to find New Jersey tea, a native shrub. It tolerates shade. Look at those beautiful flowers. It's wonderful white flowers in the summer, attracts bees and butterflies and hummingbirds. The deer tend to leave them be, which is a really plus. First time I saw it was in a national forest as an understory plant. So it tells you it's pretty shade tolerant, and will take full sun and grow in more mesic prairie situations as well. You probably know red twig dogwood. I just wanted to give a shout out to this. White flowers for the pollinators, white berries the birds eat and take away. It doesn't seem to be obnoxious. It does grow and spread and form colonies. It prefers moist to wet soil. In dry soil conditions, we've had a few droughty periods, you may get some canker. So this is one, if it's in an area that's dry, that you want to make sure it gets some water during extended dry periods. Again, a great 4-season plant. Flowers, fruit, bird appeal, butterfly, pollinator appeal, and beautiful red stems for winter. Just prune out the old stems when they're not showing great color, and you'll have it looking good. Our native bush, dwarf bush honeysuckle, Durvilla. It's not the invasive honeysuckle. It's a different genus, Durvilla lanicera, a wonderful plant with arching branches. You've got green leaves in the summer, yellow flowers in the summer when not a lot of shrubs are blooming. Great for pollinators and for hummingbirds. Hardy in zones 3 to 10. Full sun to full shade. This is very adaptable. I see this used on hillsides for erosion control. I've seen it used in foundation plantings and as an understory plant. Good fall color, kind of a purpley bronze. And again, great pollinator appeal. Calm St. John's wort. And I know I'm flying through these and I apologize. I just couldn't get rid of any more. I like this plant. I have sandy soil. I don't have irrigation, so I really try to get my plants established and they're on their own. Calm St. John wort will take moist soils and wet soils, but it also takes dry. And I find it great. Mine is covered with bees. Those yellow flowers are great. See it blooming midsummer, see it growing in full sun, see it growing in fairly heavy shade. That's what the plus is about. Those are the seed capsules, but it is very dry tolerant, which is a real plus for those. It's a smaller scale, 2 to 3 feet tall. I'll tell you, the bees just cover this when it's in bloom, and the foliage is somewhat blue-green. I love winterberry. It prefers acidic soil. So if you're growing in high pH, you may have some problems with yellowing of foliage. It's a holly, but it's a deciduous holly. It drops its leaves in winter, but look at how beautiful that is. So full sun to part shade. I've seen it in fairly shady, like on a woodland edge kind of situation. Moist to wet soil, and as I mentioned, it likes a lower pH. You do need 1 male for every 1 to 5 female to get fruit. Plant them separately. For a while, nurseries were putting a male and female together in the same pot. And then I'd get the call that I'm not getting fruit. And I'm like, do you have a male and a female? Well, I don't know. And the flowers on these are so tiny, it's hard to see if it's just got the male parts or the female parts. So plant them separately, make a note or put a tag in. So if one of your plants dies, you know what you need to replace, a male or a female. The deer tend to leave this one be as well. Dwarf Fothergilla, fragrant white flowers before the leaves emerge, and then they continue to persist. Great for hummingbirds, early visiting hummingbirds, and excellent fall color like you see here. Full sun to part shade. I've seen it pushed into a little bit heavier shade. Fall color and bloom not as good. It does like moist to well-drained soil, slightly acid, though I've seen it growing in neutral to slightly alkaline soils. Rabbits, I've had people tell me the rabbits have devastated it. So far, they've left mine alone. Shouldn't say that out loud. But the wonderful early blooms that are fragrant, excellent fall color. There are some taller species as well. Chokeberries, Aronia, black chokeberry now is listed as Photinia melanocarpa, but you'll still see it listed as Aronia. Chokeberry is a great name for both the red and black because you eat the fruit, oh, it just sucks the spit right out of your mouth. In fact, the birds don't even eat it until a little bit later in the season when they ferment a bit, and then there's not much else to choose from. Why I like the chokeberries, white flowers in the spring, glossy foliage in the summer, black fruit for the melanocarpa, red for the red chokeberry. There are some cultivars of different heights, great for a rain garden because it'll take it wet, it will take those short dry periods, it takes sun, and it takes shade. Service berries, there are shrub forms and tree forms. They really prefer moist, well-drained soils. The fruit is edible if you can beat the birds to it, often called Juneberry because those white flowers that support pollinators turn into pink fruit that turns purpley blue. They look like blueberries, and to me, they taste like nutty blueberries. Make great pies, great muffins. Also eat them raw, but the birds love them. The cedar waxwings, the robins will line up on my plants and just chow down on these. And great fall color for most of them. And so this is the fall color you'll see. So check the tag or the catalog description. Select the one that fits your area, your hardiness zone, your soil conditions, moist and well drained. Slow to get started, just like chokeberry, but once they take off, they're fairly quick to establish. I'm going to wrap this up in a few minutes, so hang in there with me. Buttonbush is another summer bloomer. Those flowers attract, I think it's like 20 different pollinators. We were shooting a video and there were bees and butterflies and skippers and regular flies, all kinds of pollinators nectaring on the flowers. Then they turn into seed pods that start out red and fade to brown. And the birds, the songbirds and small mammals will eat those seeds. And they're decorative as well. Native to marshy areas, but they will tolerate occasional dry soil. So best in moist to wet, but I've got mine growing in a little bit drier situation. Once established, they prefer moist to wet, but occasional drought like you'd have in a rain garden would work okay. Full sun to part shade. Common witch hazel. This is our native common witch hazel. Blooms in the fall. There's the fall color that you see there. This plant takes full sun to full shade. Hardy zones 3 to 8. Moist soil to dry soil once established. So it can take those understory conditions, those woodland edges. When those leaves drop off and fall, it reveals these fragrant, strappy yellow flowers. Birds eat the seeds. You'll also get mammals eating the seeds, and it's pollinated by a shivering moth that pollinates in the fall, and then the seeds, the pollen works its way through the flower in spring, pollinates the flower, the seeds ripen the following fall. It's a whole year-round process, and when they're ripe, they shoot out. So the parent plants sending their offspring far away. Bottlebrush buckeye. This is a great big, bold, shade-tolerant shrub. It can get very tall. Look at those spikes of white flowers that appear in the summer. Here in Milwaukee area, though, southeast Wisconsin, season isn't always long enough for the fruit to form, but if you're a little bit further south, it can. This thing is big, 8 to 12 feet tall, and it does spread, not aggressively, but if you're looking for an understory plant, I've seen this used next to buildings as a foundation plant, taller buildings. The fall color is yellow, and deer and rabbit tend to leave it go, but I'll tell you, the deer have munched on mine. Just a couple of non-invasive vines. Dutchman's pipe. You want to make sure it's aggressive. It's a big, vigorous vine, kind of rampant, but not doesn't spread aggressively, just tall and can climb over things. So some regular pruning. 4 to 8, and these are the flowers. And for us on this native species, they're tiny. They're small flowers under the Dutchman's pipe. And so you kind of have to watch for them early in the season. It is a host plant for pipe vine swallowtail. And I was lucky enough to see they blew into the area in southeast Wisconsin and saw that swallowtail munching on the leaves of the pipe vine in our botanic garden. Our native coral honeysuckle, Anisra sempervirens, full sun to part shade. I pushed it into fairly heavy shade, though you're even more likely to have powdery mildew, which is a problem, as well as aphids. It blooms on and off all summer, so that's a real plus. This picture was taken in the middle of July on a garden walk, and look at all the flowers on this plant. Hummingbirds love this plant as well as other pollinators. Tends to be salt tolerant, black walnut tolerant, as well as deer resistant. Major Wheeler is my favorite. It's more powdery mildew resistant. It's a cultivar of our native coral honeysuckle. I have mine growing next to my hummingbird feeder. And so I watch the hummingbirds nectar on this plant in between sipping nectar out of my feeder. And then I watch them eat any aphids that start feeding on this plant. I don't see many, and I think it's partly because the hummingbirds eat them. They need that protein to feed their young. And so they help manage my insect pest. They enjoy the nectar, and I enjoy these bright red flowers all summer long. Clematis, I'm not going to talk about pruning, though I'm happy to answer it if we have time, but there's all kinds of clematis, white, pink, purple flowers, blue flowers, different flower types, bell-shaped, downward facing. The typical flower you see here. The seed heads are gorgeous. They like full sun, but moist, cool, well-drained soil conditions. The old saying, they're facing the sun, their feet in the shade, and it's a great way to manage it. And some bloom in the spring, other cultivars, some are in species and some in the fall. We do have a native virgin's bower, Clematis virginiana. It does spread by rhizomes and seeds. It's a vigorous grower, so it will kind of take some space in your woodland areas. It is somewhat shade tolerant. This is not to be confused with sweet autumn clematis, that fragrant white flowering clematis. That's very vigorous, but they're finding it's invasive in some parts of the country. So I know I've gone through very quickly. Your handout's available. There's also tons of resources, links to information from not only the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, but university resources around the country, some of the videos that I've done with the DNR, and some of the brochures that are available to you. I always like to end every webinar or appearance with help me grow gardeners. Someone inspired you, please inspire someone else. This is my granddaughter who would probably kill me because she's now 16 and a half. But kids are more focused. Girls are less susceptible to peer pressure. We all feel better when we garden. And my goal is to grow a kinder and gentler world, one garden and gardener at a time. My information is on your handout to stay connected. Thanks again to DNR and UW Extension Natural Resources. As Kelly mentioned, we have a webinar tomorrow and many more coming. Those are listed in your handout with links for registration as well as on my website. And be sure to check out, we're doing another library program sponsored by We Energy on beauty outside your door, some video activities and webinars. I know your head's spinning, and I apologize. I couldn't decide what to eliminate. So now it's time for questions, and Jeannie and Liz will jump on board if there's any that they can answer. They've got a lot of expertise to share as well.
I just want to thank Jeannie and Liz for handling all the questions coming in the Q&A. So if you have questions, please throw them in that Q&A box. There's also a link to a survey in the chat box that Jeannie posted. So please take that. We really appreciate your feedback. So yeah, there were quite a few that they were able to answer. There are 3 that I counted questions about crown vetch, so I wonder if that might be helpful to go over just for everyone. People might be wondering if they haven't asked in the Q&A yet.
I debated Jeannie and Liz on adding that because it's a personal problem for me. So crown vetch is that ground cover they used along the freeways. It has purple flowers, pinnately compound leaves. It reseeds readily, and I hate it. It has gotten away from me, so we did some extensive mowing, and it is addressed on the DNR website. And I think it is a restricted invasive plant. And so mowing is one option. Chemicals is another. Liz, do you want to hop on and share anything in addition to that? It's awful. It's awful. And it's one you got to keep after. And I know I'm just starting to make a dent.
Yeah, it's really challenging to control, especially because it produces rhizomes. And as someone had mentioned in the comments, it was once used for along transportation corridors for erosion control. No longer used in Wisconsin, at least. I'm not aware of any other states that still use it for that purpose either, but very challenging to control. And it is a restricted species.
And I have to tell you, when I worked for Extension, I had a woman who called me and said, bought this plant. It said it 8 cans and it's on my kitchen counter. Do I need to worry? And it turned out it was crown vetch because that was one of the advertisements, right? Everything will disappear, garbage and everything will disappear in it. And yes, so no longer being used here on the roadside. But it's still, because it's just restricted, right? It's out. So we have to be vigilant to keep after it. So I've made a commitment this year to try to tackle it. And those rhizomes, like she mentioned, just go forever. So I've lost a raspberry patch. I've started over. So yeah, thanks, Liz.
I'm just going through our questions here. We have a question from Edward. Edward asks, ideas about terminating wild rose vines. They have just showed up in my 4 acres and they are a pain, literally.
So you bring up a good point. I didn't talk about, and Jeannie and Liz, feel free to jump in, but wearing long sleeves, wearing gloves, wearing long pants. One of the things I mentioned, kind of passed over quickly with the Japanese barberry, is they have found that it creates this perfect environment, Japanese barberry and honeysuckle, for ticks. And so the ticks like the high humidity. Deer walk by, the deer brush on the plant, the ticks can get on the deer can bring it into your landscape, so can the mice. And so that's an extra motivation to manage that. And they have spines. So my point was, wearing long sleeves, maybe leather gloves, protecting yourself, safety glasses, so you don't accidentally with a stick in your eye when you're trying to prune and manage these as well. Cutting them back to ground level, digging them up if possible. One of the things that I read, and Jeannie and Liz may want to chime out. So one of the things we can do is cut some of those woody plants back to the ground and do a stump treatment. If you look under the buckthorn removal and honeysuckle, cutting them back, you can treat the stump with a total vegetation killer, and it's absorbed and will kill the root system depending on the plant. I think it was the DNR in Minnesota found or recommended you could also cover that cut stump if you just have a few with a tin can, so you're heating it up. Or I've seen people sell squares of black plastic. Now that's not going to work well for a large infestation, but it might help for those outliers. I don't know if Jeannie or Liz, you have anything about the roses to add for our caller?
I just put an answer in the
Thank you.
Q&A for someone who asked about where they could buy native roses, and I put the link in there from DNR's list of Wisconsin native plant nurseries.
Good
I can
point.
put that in the chat too.
Thank you. And on your handout, there is a source, the DNR source for sources for native plants as well, and some information on them. So the multiflora rose is the invasive rose that was used as a root graft, used for conservation purposes. Then the birds took the seeds, spread them into areas. It's invading, like this Ed mentioned, prairies, natural areas. So Jeannie, you bring up a good point. There are some native roses out there as well, but probably not one if it's taking over. So check out, I think there's on the DNR website, directions on managing the multiflora rose, I'm pretty sure, and it's restricted, I think. I'm looking at Liz, which she can't. She's my restricted prohibited expert here on the terrestrials. And but I'm pretty sure is there a link on the DNR for it? Multiflora rose?
It is restricted, and I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you, Liz. That's why I asked them, please come and join me, because they've got such a great wealth of information. So that'll have some ID.
Because we both did. I didn't see Liz did it.
Oh, that's okay. Repetition, key to success.
So I've got lots of thanks coming in from people who joined us tonight. So thank you all. Question from Tammy. Tammy says she wants to know if you have thoughts on spraying vinegar on plants to kill them. I've had success using this on the driveway and sidewalks.
Okay, great question. And I know some of the natural cures have been researched, and I always like to do research-based information. One of the concerns is the concentration of vinegar, and I think it is, I'm trying to remember who I will share this. I'm making a note. There's a certain, I forget the percentage, it's a higher percentage of concentration than what we typically have when we buy vinegar that's needed. Remember some of those things that are non-selective. So like glyphosate, Roundup is non-selective, and that means it could kill any plant, has the potential to kill any plant it touches. So you could go kill, let's say you've got a plant growing in the lawn that you don't want, and so you spray it with Roundup, you'll have a dead patch of grass as well as that weed that you tried to kill. Vinegar, don't use gasoline. You can wreck your soil with some of these home remedies, but I know they're doing some research on vinegar. Most of what I read, not as effective. The benefit in sidewalk and pavers, like you mentioned, and even some of the soap concentrations, like burnout, is has a clove smell, and it's a plant-based product, and those will burn the tops off, and that's typically what vinegar does, is burns the top off. And so for annuals, if you get them at the right time, it works well. I like using those organic products, especially in the pavers and walk, because if somebody's walking over them, it's not going to hurt them, going barefoot on the sidewalk. And so there are some plant-based vegetation killers like burnout. Some that use iron phosphate, but that's a broadleaf weed killer, so you have to be careful. It will kill broadleaf plants, good and bad. It has the potential. And then the vinegar, I will get the right concentration and get Kelly a link to include in your thank you when you get that message.
I did put a link to the USDA study on using vinegar as an herbicide in the chat.
Well, then thank you, Liz. See, you won't need to hear from me. That's great. Thanks, Liz. I appreciate that.
Thank you. So just as a reminder, this is being recorded, so we'll send out that link probably in a few days here. So you'll be able to rewatch this if you didn't catch everything tonight.
And when I want to just mention too, if you do, please do the survey. Liz added a question after she saw I don't know if that's what motivated you, Liz, but what should I have spent more time on? Or if we do another one, what should we concentrate on? What would you have liked to heard more of and less of? Our partnership is continuing through 2025, so we may have an opportunity to do some more webinars. So I'm glad she included that. So sorry to interrupt, Kelly, but please do the survey. We do look at those answers.
Thank you. Yeah, you'll find a link to that survey in the chat box, so please take that. Question from Hillary. Hillary says, we have buckthorn growing between our arborvitae and a cyclone fence. We practically have to get it in our bellies to get at it. We've tried chopping and covering with black plastic. Any suggestions for getting rid of buckthorn where it's hard to reach?
You might want to try the cut and paint the surface with, depending on the size. So the small stuff, obviously, is not what you're dealing with. An inch or smaller, a lot of people will pop out with a weed wrench. Now you are disturbing the soil, so you are bringing some of the seeds to the surface, but you probably are going to be needing to repeat anyway because it's probably been dropping fruit. You might want to cut it and then treat that stump. And that way, and then being careful that that product doesn't touch the leaves of your arborvitae. Maybe the can will give you an easier option that you can cover it and secure it a little bit better. Being in the shade of the arborvitae, I'm wondering too if it's not getting quite the heat it may need to cook it a bit. But I'd try the cut and treat the stump, and then being careful that you don't touch your arborvitae. I don't know, Liz, if you have any other suggestions, or Jeannie? That's a tough one, isn't it?
That is a tough one. You
So
covered it
yeah,
well.
I would try that. One of the things I didn't mention too with chemicals, you can treat, as I mentioned, cut and treat the stump. When they're 6 inches in diameter, you can paint the bottom 12 inches. And then I was at this webinar or this presentation on invasives, and they do this, they cut into the trunk and then apply the herbicide in there. And then there's also this jet cartridge, which is kind of pricey, that I'm going to do some exploring, and I might try that on my buckthorn. I don't know if Jeannie or Liz have had any experience with it, but it's kind of, it injects the herbicide into the trunk of the plant so that you're minimizing the environmental exposure. And I thought it might be, I don't know how this was just one possibility and one recommendation. It is kind of pricey, but if you've got
as hard as it gets, it might be worth a try. And like I noticed, so we have a lot of buckthorn on the farm, and my husband's been cutting it and using rodeo. I'm not sure if that's the right chemical to do the cut stump treatments. And you got to be really careful too, because some of those things, it's like it almost expands out even if you put it on. So I don't know if rodeo is it. I don't want to knock a particular product when I don't know for sure. But yeah, getting good advice from maybe a chemical applicator or something might even be worth it, because you don't want to end up like sometimes a Mazapir, which is used for big treatments of Fragmides. It can, some research has shown it can cause other things not to grow for a while. So of course, maybe a non-native, but
and Tordon, which I was recommended, which is hard on groundwater and things like that, they're also finding it's hard on oaks. And so it's one that is often recommended, but you've got to be very careful how you apply it, because you could damage the oak trees. That's where my buckthorn is. So I'm like, well, that's not happening. I think glyphosate is the active ingredient often used near water, but they could have changed the formulation. So Jeannie, you're absolutely right. Checking the DNR website, checking your local DNR if you're not from Wisconsin, checking the label as well. And then the other thing is, if it spreads by rhizomes, things like black locust, what they found too is if you cut and treat the stump, it does exactly what you're saying, Jeannie, that it sends up shoots all along that rhizome that it's sending out. So knowing exactly how to treat. I did put some links from some of the plants, and also at the end to Mark Renz's Midwest Invasive Plants. He's got some great fact sheets. Some of them are linked at the DNR website too. I found that out, Jeannie, as I was reviewing. Oh, that was his information. Great pictures, good detail for identification, and some good insights and control as well. So I would check some of those links that are in the handout, and when you're doing your search, and that resource listing at the bottom.
I just put a link in the chat too that goes to a table on the DNR's website that has all of our regulated species, and each species has a link right to its webpage. It's a very handy youth resource. I use it all the time.
It is, because the only way I can get what I need is I go Wisconsin DNR and then list the plant. So thank you, Liz. You'll make life easier for everybody. Thanks.
I think Jeannie put a comment in the chat box too, just mentioning that a lot of the links are in Melinda's handout, so be sure to check that out as well. There was a related question I saw in the Q&A from Pat. Pat is asking how to get rid of mulberry tree starts. Is that similar to the stump treatment we talked about?
So here's mulberries are not listed as invasive, and I have seen them recommended. I have a friend that loves the fruit. I lived in the city, and the park had a mulberry, and we had mulberries up and down the alley in my garden beds. and the birds eat them, and you know they poop them because you can see the purple stains on everything. So it's not an invasive plant. So there are a couple things that might be happening. Seeds that
Melinda?
are being dropped. Yes.
Sorry, white
Is it
mulberry is
oh, white?
restricted.
Oh, thank you. See, that's why I need to have these guys keeping track. So white mulberry is, the purple one is not, correct? Am I right? Thank you. So if it's a white mulberry, definitely. And even if it's not, even if it's got the purple fruit, you'd want to control it anyway, because it creates it. There's a lot of them, or just manage. So a couple things. It might be seedlings, and that's pulling them, just like the Norway maple seedlings that appear under your tree every year when they drop those thousands of helicopters, or your neighbor's plant does. And weeding them out in the garden beds is really all you can do. Mulching may help suppress a little bit, but I found they grew through the mulch for the most part. Mowing in your lawn area, that would also work with those mulberry seedlings that might be dropped. If there's suckers coming up from the base of the plant, when you have suckers coming up from apples, crab apples, plums, and cherries, if you could pull back the soil cut right above the root, that won't stop it from producing more, but it's a way to slow it down. And then if you do get larger plantings, then cutting and doing the stump treatment would be an option, as long as it's your plant on your property, not your neighbor's, okay?
Thank you. Question from Terry. Terry's asking, or Terry says, I have Mukgenia, Mukgenia, and
Okay.
it doesn't seem to grow very much. I've had this plant for a few years now. Any suggestions?
It's one that's kind of new to me. I think it's kind of resembles a little bit of a coral bell, if it's what I'm thinking, kind of leafy plant, ornamental, depending on where you're at too. I think we're kind of at its, I don't know, I can't remember its hardiness. And if it's the plant I'm thinking of, and I apologize, I can't remember the hardiness on this one, but I find it's slow to take off, even where I've seen it in pretty good soil conditions, moist well drain, full to part sun. So make sure it's in the right growing conditions. You might want to use a little slow release fertilizer to encourage top and bottom growth. A lot of our plants the first couple years, especially those that are kind of struggling, put their energy into the roots, and they're slower to put on the top growth. So I make sure you've got it in the right spot. And if that doesn't sound like I'm answering the right question, info@melindamyers.com. You can send a picture of the plant if you happen to have one, so I can make sure we're talking about the same plant. And I'll be glad to do a little follow-up if needed. So info@melindamyers.com. If you have a picture, that makes it easier for both of us. If not, if you have the botanical name, that's great.
I'm seeing a question in the chat from Barb, and actually I see Liz marked wanting to answer this one, but I wonder if more people would want to hear the answer to this. What do we do if we find a restricted plant? How and why do they get into Wisconsin, and shouldn't they be truly restricted from coming in?
Yay, go for it, Liz.
So if you find a restricted plant, if you mean just on the landscape, control is good. We don't mandate control, so you're not required to control it, but of course we would like to see it controlled. But if you're talking for sale, if you find any restricted species for sale, so they are illegal to sell, same as prohibited species. So if you find them for sale, I'll put my email in the chat. You can send the report to me. If it's online, screenshots of the sale online are good. And if it's a business, just send me the name of the business. So they often get into Wisconsin through different trade routes. So if we're talking plants, through things like nurseries, or more frequently online sales these days. And while it is illegal for nurseries to sell them, sometimes they're unaware, things sneak through. So it does happen occasionally. So it's always good to make sure when you're buying plants that they are not a restricted species, because sometimes just because it's for sale doesn't mean it's not invasive.
One of the good things Liz shared with me is that she's seeing fewer incidents on nurseries of invasive plants being sold, whether it's they're unaware or whatever. But the online thing is a big, a lot of us go online because we can't find certain plants from our local garden centers, always the first place to start, our local nursery, but we'll often go online. And so, as Liz mentioned, always check too. And prohibited plants in your state, let the Department of Natural Resources know so that they can help identify those that are in waterways, woodland, natural areas. Do you want to mention anything on that, Liz or Jeannie?
Yeah, I'll put another email in the chat. It's our general invasive species mailbox. If you ever see any invasive species growing or for sale, that could also go there.
Thanks.
Let's see, we've got some more questions here. Karen is asking, we have several Eastern Wahoo and have never gotten seedlings from them. They get seeds and have even tried planting the seeds in different places, but nothing's ever come from them. Do you know how I can start some of these?
One of the things with woody plants is a lot of them have they all have different ways that the seeds may need to be stratified, may need to go through a bird for the seed coat to break down so that it's viable and can sprout. And that may be part of it. If it's in a garden bed, maybe the seedlings are accidentally getting weeded out. I usually say if the seeds are produced in the fall, and you're trying to germinate them yourselves, kind of mimic what nature would do. So it'd fall to the soil, it would get a cold, a damp treatment, and then warm in the spring. So you may need to do it. Some of those things with fleshy coverings like the euonymus have. Think about a tomato too. Sometimes we soak them to separate the seed from the fleshy covering, or let it dry and then remove that fleshy covering so those seeds are exposed. That's another one I want to do a little hunting on. I always double check with those woody plants. So Michael Durr, DIRR, has a great resource, the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, and he covers propagation, whether it's by seeds, or you might even want to try to do some cuttings or layering. Sometimes those lower branches even will lay on the ground and root in, but taking cuttings and timing for those is real important as well. So I am happy to, I'm making a note to make sure I look that up and get back to you on that. But info@melindamyers.com. And I can send you, I'll double check on the timing on that, whatever's important. The other thing is they may be setting seedlings other places. Those birds are taking them and they're not in your locale. So that might be the other thing. And that's a native, so that's a okay burning bush.
Before you go next one, someone asked in the Q&A if chat and QA show up in the replay, and I can't remember.
I think if you tell it, do you have yours show up? That's a great.
Yeah, I think the chat is saved as a separate file in Zoom. I am not 100% sure on the Q&A. I want to say I think it is, but I'm not certain.
I think if you click on the 3 dots in the chat, you have an option to save chat. I think everybody has that. So everyone who's still on, if you want to save the chat, just go to you're going to put in a message, the 3 dots in the upper right hand of where you type that in. Click on that, and there's a save chat is the first option, and it will go somewhere in your computer. I think it'll tell you.
It could be the download folder, so maybe check there first. So Nancy put in the chat a really good point. MMSD has a plant sale for many of the native plants that were mentioned, and I believe that starts in April. I want to say they take orders online, but it's local pickup.
Well, and it also it's now. It ends April 4th. Yeah, they just posted. No, that's okay. They just posted it. So this is new news. They do sell rain garden plants to people in their service area at a discounted price. And there is a minimum this year, $45 order, which, who can't use $45 worth of plants? The idea is to encourage all of us to, 1, plant natives, and 2, encouraging people to do rain gardens. So that's part of the inspiration for tomorrow's talk on planting rain gardens. But thank you for mentioning it. Milwaukee Metro Sewage District Rain Garden Plant Sale, and it was just put on the website. When they're out, they're out. So you want to order soon. You want to order early, and then you pick them up, as Kelly mentioned, at MMSD headquarters in downtown Milwaukee. Great point. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, yeah, thanks everyone so much for your questions. There was a follow-up from Kate about the Muckgenia. Kate says that I think the person was talking about Muckdenia.
Yeah,
So
that's
to
what
start, oh,
that's what I, sorry, thank you. I thought that's what they were too, but thank you, because that's why I'm like, well, and did she have any comments on what kind of luck she's had?
Yeah, she says I have some and it's a nice cover that remains green and then in fall has a lovely color.
Okay. So she's having some good luck. So maybe that'll rub off on us all. Mine didn't do too well, but it could have been benign neglect, a little too much neglect. So maybe that's the same problem the other person had. And thank you for clarifying that Muckdenia. I bet that's what it was.
And just as a reminder, please, if you have a moment, fill out that survey. Jeannie just shared a link in the chat again. So if you have a moment, we really appreciate your feedback. Still some more questions here. So let's see. We've got a question from Robert. Robert is asking, are the ISG water lilies a good idea?
I'm not sure what the ISG water lilies are. So I'm guessing it's, go ahead, Liz.
I had to look this up as well because I wasn't familiar with it either. It's the intersubgeneric water lilies.
Oh, okay.
It's a blue hardy water lily. Apparently, it's been the goal of water lily hybridizers for the past 100 years.
Okay, so it's an interspecific cross that's probably brought the blue in and brought the hardiness. So that would be one to try in your personal garden, but not to release in natural waterways. And again, does it give a hardiness on there, Liz? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
That's okay. I'm looking at the website. I'm not seeing anything, at least on the
Okay.
website I saw.
It'd be one to try. I would buy one and, double check the hardiness for your zone. Hybrids tend to have better vigor. That's why we want to keep those non-natives out of our waterways because we don't want them taking over. But in your personal water feature, water garden, not in a public waterway, might be worth a try. But I'd try one, then let us all know how it does for you.
Question from Debbie. Debbie's wondering if you have any advice on removing creeping bellflower.
Oh, creeping bellflower, beautiful flowers, spreads by rhizome. It is very difficult to control. I don't know if that's listed as a restricted plant or not here. It does spread by rhizomes, and any of those things that spread by rhizomes, when we dig them up, it's so easy to leave a little bit left. So this is one that you may want to do a couple things. You could try digging and removal, then hopefully you have fewer of them to treat. You could use a total vegetation killer. What I will do if I'm doing a plant amongst other plants, cut the bottom out of a milk jug, put it over the weed, and spray so that I don't accidentally hit the good plant surrounding it, let it drip dry. And then once dry, I move it to the next one and the next one. Or if I've got more weeds than I do good plants, I'll cover the good plants and then treat the weeds, brushing it on with a paintbrush so it's absorbed through the leaves. So regular mowing, digging is going to be your best bet, but then monitor, because it's going to take a while. It's going to take several treatments of total vegetation killer and regular digging too. So it's a tough one. I wish I had an easier solution for you.
Kathy is wondering how to control mint.
I'm laughing because I spoke at the Northwest Flower Show a few years ago, and the woman, one of the plant people there, said, "I love mint. It's like a little amoeba going through the garden." And I'm like, I don't like mint. I don't need an amoeba going through my garden. It does spread by rhizomes. It is very aggressive. So again, that's one you may want to dig up and remove. Don't compost, because your compost probably is not going to kill it. You'll be planting it back in. Again, this is where you can do some total vegetation killers. Broadleaf weed killers go to the soil and they stay in the soil. So things like dandelion, things you'd use on your dandelion in the lawn, it doesn't harm the grass if you apply it properly, because the way the vessels in the plant that move water and nutrients in monocots, grass-like plants, are different than those in broadleaf plants. So that's why it doesn't kill them. But if you put it on a plant that's growing in a garden and it gets in the soil, your good plants could take it up. And especially in hot, dry summers, the summer of '95 was another hot, dry year. And farmers found the next year they used herbicides that they normally used in their fields. They had damage because the lack of rain, those herbicides weren't washed out of the soil or absorbed by the plant at the normal rate. And so it was like a double dose almost of that weed killer. So always read and follow label directions. That's why those total vegetation killers that are synthetic are absorbed through the leaves and the stems and the roots. The organic ones will burn the tops off. So just regular cutting, using those repeatedly so you starve the plant. But there's a little sprout here and a little sprout there. And so it's hard to really get good control cutting. You have to be very persistent whatever you use, but always read and follow label directions for when you can replant after applying it. Some people will plant their mint in a bucket in the ground with an inch of the lip at the top. But then you're going to want drainage holes, right? So if it gets wet, it doesn't drown and rot. And then the roots, the rhizomes, I've seen them come out the bottom, and I've seen them climb over that inch on top. I think in a pot on cement or a deck or someplace where it can't seed into or spread into your garden is probably important. Oregano in the mint family is another one I had it growing in a pot on my patio and found it off the edge of the patio where it had reseeded, and I had to start managing it in there, which I didn't plant it. It just found its way into the surrounding landscape off my patio.
So Chuck is wondering, or mentions that you mentioned rose mallow. How does that compare to hollyhock mallow?
Always look at there's a hollyhock mallow that is in the true mallow family. The rose mallow is a hibiscus. And so that's where botanical names come in handy. And I included those on the handout as well. The hollyhock mallow is perennial. I'm pretty sure it's a perennial up here. And it's a whole different group of plants. And so it can be kind of aggressive in the garden. It's not invasive. It's got a cool little flower. The mallows have flowers that look like hollyhocks, but they can be a lot more aggressive. The rose mallow forms actually somewhat woody stem. It dies back to the ground, but it's a thicker, tougher stem, and the flower's much bigger. So it has the more pronounced reproductive part too that's very typical of a hibiscus. So that's where those botanical names come in handy. So when you get a plant tag or order from a catalog, saving those for future reference is really helpful when you're looking for more information. So I'm glad you asked that. Great question.
Right, getting down to the last questions here. Cynthia is wondering how to eliminate creeping Charlie.
We were waiting for that question. That was, I think, the #1 question in January. Creeping Charlie was brought here as a ground cover. It does very well in shade. That's usually where I find it starts in the shade and then goes to the sun. It's very an excellent weed in compacted, moist to damp soil conditions. If it's growing in your lawn, improving the growing conditions of your lawn is the best way to manage lawn weeds. Aerate if it's compacted, remove thatch, core aerating opens up X ways for water, nutrients to get down to the roots. Dethatching lifts that thatch layer. Your lawn looks awful, but it removes that thatch layer. You can compost that. And then if needed, you can overseed. So improving the drainage. In shady areas, consider using a shade-tolerant ground cover instead of trying to grow grass. And you can use a broadleaf weed killer in the lawn, in your lawn area. You'd apply it when it's in full bloom. Like usually for us, it's around the 3rd week of May or after the first hard frost in the fall. Now, remember, it's dropped lots of seeds. And so one of the problems is you may treat it this year and kill the parent plant, but little seedlings will come. So it can take some time. Dicamba and Banville are the ones that are touted as the best, and it will kill it, but it's hard on our trees and shrubs. So I really hate to use that too often or at all because I worry about the longevity of our trees and shrubs. So fixing the growing conditions. In your garden bed dig, it does spread by rhizomes. Little pieces can start a new plant. So that could be another one you might want to spot treat with a total vegetation killer like a glyphosate, or Finale has a different mode of operation. But again, protect the nearby desirable plants in your garden beds.
Forgot that I was muted. Just as a reminder, we'll be sending out the recording probably in a few days here. So keep an eye out in your email inboxes for that, along with the handout, and then links that we've shared in the chat here. Let's see. Are you good for 1 or 2 more questions, Melinda?
I am. And Liz and
Okay.
Jeannie, if you can't stay around, I understand. But if you can, that's always helpful.
We did just see a question about someone couldn't find the phenology calendar on the handout.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
listed as,
Growing ag.
it's Wisconsin. Oh man, I don't have my handout printed in front of me. And I
We
don't
did
think,
each put it, I put it in the Q&A and Liz also
okay.
put it in the chat.
I think it's Wisconsin invasive species. The link in the resources doesn't say calendar on it.
Oh, I found it.
It says
Yeah.
Wisconsin Invasive Species Calendar.
Oh, it
Yeah.
does. Okay, so it is on your.
Oh.
Okay, so that's a long list of resources.
Towards
Can you
the
tell?
end.
Yeah, can you tell I taught for a living and I worked for the government in the past? Got more is better. So as this webinar proved, sorry you guys. I really tried to eliminate some things, but sorry.
There's so much to talk about. All right, so we've got Steffi and Joanne wondering how to control wild parsnips / get rid of bindweed.
I'll take bindweed if one of you takes wild parsnips. So bindweed has roots that can be very, very deep and spread like 9 feet. And here's the deal, and I have this in my garden also. Persistently cutting it back. So, but you have to check every couple of weeks and make sure you get all of it because it does have rhizomes and will spread. It also likes to crawl in your shrubs, and so it makes it hard. So you have to be persistent if you use the pull it or dig it out method or cutting it to the ground level. You've got to be persistent. Like we're talking every couple weeks. That's another one you may opt to use. I try not to use chemicals in my landscape. I might be forced to do that for the crown vetch, and the field bindweed is getting ahead of me. I just can't seem to keep up with it. I kind of look at these as that stopgap, kind of get it under control so then I can keep up with it down the road with less use of chemicals. So consistently cutting it back to the ground, digging it up, consistently checking, be persistent. And even if you use a total vegetation killer, again, protect your nearby plants. And you're going to have to be persistent because they're going to be, it may take a couple applications to get it under control. And I don't know if either of you want to add anything to that, but if one of you, if Liz, if you don't mind taking the wild parsnip question, that'd be great.
I also just wanted to say that if your question didn't get answered verbally, check the answer tab. Some questions were answered through piping. So that does include the wild parsnip, which Jeannie had responded to. Jeannie, did you want to talk about your response or add to it?
Well, I don't know if it's the best response in the world, but I mentioned that I know for roadway managers, they recommend mowing it just before it sets seed so that at least you can, so if you're digging, but you're still getting more and more plants, if some of the seed is, I mean, if you get a seed bank, it's going to take a while regardless. But other than that, I don't know what to offer other than, unfortunately, chemical treatment.
And you mentioned the mowing, and I have heard some of the experts talk about, and the reason you do it before it sets seed is you want to get some growth so it doesn't have a chance to then try to do set the seed later. You cut it back too soon, it may have enough energy to set seed later anyway. And then, as you mentioned, consistently mow, it's going to take more than one for that seed bank. And I think there's some good information. I didn't put a link to this one. There were some invasive plants and some problems we didn't address, but I think if you go to the DNR site, I think there is information on wild parsnip, and I think UW Extension may have something as well, University of Wisconsin Extension.
Probably because it's been a problem for a long time.
Yes, exactly. And that's one that many people are allergic to, so you want to be careful.
I put a link to
Yeah,
the UW
I
Extension's
hesitate
fact
even to
sheet.
say things about mowing because I've heard that land managers are really careful with what they wear when they mow because of those oils.
Washing your clothes separately, doing a rinse load. And I don't know if you heard Liz said she put a link to the UW Extension publication. Thank you, Liz.
There's a lot of good information on control options in that publication.
And that's a great point about the oils too, with those things that tend to have an allergic reaction, can cause allergic reaction. You want to be very careful with doing laundry separately and how you manage your clothes too. So thanks for bringing that up. Good point.
All right, well, thanks so much to everyone that joined us tonight for this presentation. Again, we'll send up the link to the recording and the handout and those other links that we mentioned this evening. So also, don't forget to sign up for tomorrow's webinar. Melinda, is this the one that's with MMSD, how to plan your rain garden?
Right. I'm infiltrating Kelly's life here. We're doing quite a few things with the library. So yeah, how to plan a rain garden is tomorrow. And then we'll do one on selecting the plant so you can get the right plant and then some more information. So it's all about managing water. And this is also important because invasive plants are contributing to climate change because they mess up the environment. They prevent forests from regenerating. Invasive insect pests weaken our forests, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So if you need more motivation as you're trying to work your way through the Dames rocket, the buckthorn, the honeysuckle, just trying to help give you some reasons that it's helping in a lot of different ways. So I want to thank everyone. Jeannie, Liz, thank you. Lifesavers, always fun to work with. And thanks for your sponsorship, Kelly, for hosting, but all of you who took the time to join me, because obviously you want to help us tackle the invasive species. And avoidance, as Jeannie reminds me, is the first step and sometimes an easier way to put your foot in the water towards dealing with it, a little less depressing than looking at the big ones. So if we avoid it, we're taking care of a lot of problems before they become problems and giving us more time to tackle those that are already in place.
Well, thank you so much, Melinda. Thank you, Jeannie and Liz. This has been wonderful. So I hope everyone has a great evening and keep an eye out for that follow-up email. We will send recordings and links and resources your way. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.